Hi, it's David Temkin, and you're watching Crash Course World History. And today we're talking about economics during the end of World War II and a ski resort in New Hampshire. World War II was a period of time where the world was pounded by bloodshed and loss, and the end of it called for some much-needed changes in global policies. Countries were largely independent, and there was a general lack of unity. After the already individualist views of World War I, the Great Depression and World War II continued to go on and reinforce these individualistic mindsets. Nations came to the realization that some sort of reform was needed to address this, and so it was. Between June 1st and June 22nd, a summit was held in the mountains of Bretton, New Hampshire. This summit, attended by 44 nations, would go on to create some of the most important institutions for global finance of the 21st century. As a result of World War I, Europe was an utter economic mess. This was especially true for the countries Great Britain, France, Russia, and Germany because of their increased involvement in the war. The 4 years of seemingly pointless fighting, death, and loss depleted nearly every nation's monetary and physical supply. On its most basic level, World War I was a war to be won by those who had the largest bulk of resources, ready to be tossed to battle. This extreme depletion of resources ensured the fate of the countries after the war, as all of their money was contributed towards the war effort. Any manufactured goods that may have been around prior to the fighting was used up for the war effort. Following their economic devastation, Germany, Great Britain, and France all struggled to regain the economic, military, industrial, and political strength that they all had prior to the war. The United States, however, thanks to their limited involvement, saw a period of huge economic growth relative to other countries. This boom, though, was followed by a total economic collapse. The U.S. stock market crashed in October 1929 and thus created a domino effect of financial devastation throughout the whole world. Countries in Europe who were tied to the U.S. were greatly affected, as the U.S. was not able to monetarily keep these strong ties regarding trade and industrial development. Additionally, the value of gold was crushed, and nearly every country with a gold-backed currency suffered. This was the majority, as every country in the Western world had large gold reserves. This was significantly worsened due to the United States' post-economic World War I growth, as during this time, the U.S. owned a notable portion of the world's gold. This then contributed to other countries in Europe depression. The choice to reform the gold standard would soon be made during the Bretton Woods Conference. Industrialized nations and those supplying primary products such as food and raw materials were all affected in one way or another. In Germany, the United States industrial output fell by about 15%, and between 25 and 33% in the industrial labor force was unemployed. After the international effects of the Great Depression and World War II, the global community had decided enough was enough. It was time for new economic policies to be put in place. A huge summit was decided to be held at Bretton Woods, in a secluded environment in which distractions would be minimized. The mood at Bretton Woods was very busy in the day, but during the evening, the economists would attend large drinking parties. Hold on, is that the open letter I heard? Huh. Apparently, one Canadian economist had made sure that every evening at 1:30 a.m. a performance was held. As he described it, to enable the drafting committee, including the chairman, to join the party downstairs in the moon room and observe the titillating gyrations of Conchita, the Peruvian bombshell. Thus refreshed and reinvigorated, we were able to carry on with renewed vigor for another hour or more. That's the governor of the Central Bank of Canada talking. Anyways, many of the world's major countries attended, including France, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China. The goal of the conference was to create stability in the global economy and develop a currency which would secure trading between countries. Because of the drastic decrease in gold, countries began printing their own money, and without a standard to compare it to, the value of each country's currency rose and fell substantially. This affected international trading and almost destroyed it as a whole, because without anything to compare a certain country's currency with, paying them or getting paid from them became exceedingly difficult. Different countries had different ideas about how this was going to be accomplished, as the US and the UK both tried tirelessly to secure their currency as the standard. The United States was ultimately the victor and secured the US dollar as the joint global currency standard along with gold. This would now mean that should a Swiss clock manufacturer need Canadian wood, The purchase would be made simple and in dollars. Prior to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, this would have been a logistical nightmare, as neither country nor business would know in which currency to make the transaction in. This went on to create an international reliance on the dollar and led to the US solidifying itself as the dominant world economy for trade. There were several new global economic institutions that were created as a result of the Bretton Woods Conference. These new institutions included the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. All of these financial agreements were implemented with the common goal of connecting the world economies and were ratified by the 44 nations in attendance, with the exception of the Soviet Union ratifying the International Monetary Fund. The IBRD, or International Bank of Reconstruction and Development's goal, was to provide financial assistance and loans to developing nations. This was to help bolster their economies as well as reduce their poverty rates. The IBRD received its funding through loans it granted, as well as investment in external markets and funding from member nations of the World Bank. It has been instrumental in growth in developing economies since its institution in 1944 by lending tens of billions of dollars annually. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was instituted with the goal of countering the sharp economic declines that occurred internationally during the Great Depression. Countries encountered these declines due to global currency standard being gold. The instinctive reactions of these nations was to put up trade barriers and adopt isolationist tactics. These trade barriers devalued national currencies and led to a global reduction in trade. The objective of the IMF was to try to prevent this happening again and make trade easier for the future. It also had the goal of maintaining employment rates and sustaining economic growth. The IMF operated similarly to a bank and worked jointly with the World Bank. It would provide money and capital in the form of loans to typically already developed countries who were having financial instability. They were a sort of lender of last resort, meaning that countries would typically only look to the IMF for loans if absolutely necessary. The decision to use dollars for the IMF was finalized along with its creation, similarly to the IBRD. It, over time, has accumulated over 180 member nations and is crucial in maintaining capitalism internationally. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was an agreement on international trade that was thought of and partially written during the Bretton Woods Conference and would later be ratified in Geneva by the United Nations 3 years later. The GATT and its focus were to reduce tariffs and trade barriers set up by nation. A tariff is a tax that's placed on an import by a nation. The purpose of a tariff is to incentivize consumers to buy domestic products rather than imports. This means that if a Russian wants to buy an American pen that costs $1 in the US, without the cost of shipping, that pen will cost about $1.20 in Russia. 20 cents of these will go to the state. The GATT agreement would theoretically promote free trade and prevent countries from engaging in unfair isolationist trade practices. Prior to the GATT, average tariffs on trade were approximately 22%. Less than 20 years after the Bretton Woods Conference, during the Kennedy round of GATT negotiations, tariffs were down to only 15%. The state of the world economy was radically different to what it was prior to the Bretton Woods Conference, and it was pretty much an improvement in every way possible. Despite the Cold War, the relative peace following World War II, coupled with new technology and newly founded global economic institutions, created a period of huge financial growth worldwide. Since the year 1969, world gross domestic product, or GDP, has grown over $50 trillion. $17 trillion worth of the world GDP belong to the United States. This is partially due to U.S. innovation, but also due to the United States being strengthened by having the dominant world currency following the Bretton Woods Conference. The institutions did not just help the U.S., though. In 1947, the IBRD granted France over $2 billion in infrastructure grants to help after the end of the war. It also has helped many countries in both Asia and Africa. It has granted hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries since its institution and has helped improve their individual qualities of life. The International Monetary Fund has also supported many developed countries by granting them loans to be paid back, operating similarly to a bank. The IMF most recently gave a $110 billion loan to the country of Greece in order to help them with their financial crisis. However, it has not been all good for these two institutions. Both the IBRD and IMF has come under scrutiny since their creation due to poor austerity measures. The IMF has supported known dictatorships in both Romania and Zaire. Due to this, it has unintentionally become a focus of anti-globalization movements. The IBRD, on the other hand, has granted multiple long-term loans to countries who will likely not be able to repay the bank. This has meant that on multiple occasions the IBRD has had large monetary losses. On the other hand, the GATT has had mostly positive effects on the world economy. It has helped reduce tariffs all throughout the 20th century up until 1993, when the Uruguay round of negotiations reduced tariffs to 5%. After this, the GATT was reformed and became the base of the World Trade Organization. The Bretton Woods Conference drastically changed how the world economy was run, which, from the United States' perspective, is extremely positive. But any international changes in regards to money will and have always been accepted differently in different areas of the world. It is important to recognize that changes that affect the entire world will never benefit everyone, and that when looking at history and analyzing history, focusing on one event or one place will never give you the entire story.
Internal magnetic forces